one of the people who has seen the corrosive effects of education on students and in being attacked by students herself is Heather McDonald. Heather is a bold, fearless speaker. She writes about a number of topics from identity politics to education to the war on cops and well beyond. She's a Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. Her latest book, which I urge you to pick up, is The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. And I am so pleased today to be joined by Heather McDonald. Heather, this is Ben Weingarten on the Wilkow Majority. How are you today?
Ben, it's such an honor to be with you. I always love talking to you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and I should mention that Heather and I had a very long but powerful conversation on the Big Ideas podcast that I urge you to listen to supplement kind of what we're going to talk about today. And I want to start at the very highest level, Heather, which is what has been, well, first of all, when you walk into a university today, what is the curriculum like on campus?
The curriculum is completely fragmented. There is no coherent vision. The faculty have completely abdicated their responsibility to set intellectual standards, to put knowledge into the empty noggins of students who have been deprived of learning already through most of K through 12. And instead of a curriculum that would ensure that people understand precisely those gifts that you were talking about, Ben, and understand the glory of Western civilization and the greatest works that have been created. The students are taught from the moment they step foot on campus to think of themselves either as the oppressed or as oppressors. There is a extraordinarily narcissistic delusion that has taken over college campuses, which holds that they are places of lethal bigotry against females and so-called students of color, which is limited to blacks and Hispanics. And a vast amount of tuition dollars are going into creating these huge diversity bureaucracies, the vice chancellors of equity, diversity, and inclusion, the deanlets, the vice provosts of diversity and anti-hate campaigns, whose only function is to keep this completely narcissistic delusion going and make sure that students, when they graduate, carry it with them into the world at large. And what I am most worried about, Ben, is that this poisonous identity politics, which is based on a lie, is now transforming the world at large.
And identity politics, in many respects, is sort of a natural outgrowth of cultural Marxism, and that concept of cultural Marxism has been passed down over the generation. So it isn't just that schools are terrible today in terms of the ideas that are promulgated. This is really a multi-generational issue, isn't it?
Yes, this has been going on for decades, and it's been hard, frankly, to get people to pay attention to what's going on in the academy. The one upside to the accelerated assaults on free speech and free thinking over the last 4 years or so has been that it's finally gotten Americans' attention that there's something very wrong going on college campuses when mainstream conservatives like myself or Ben Shapiro are met with force, sometimes actual violence, like in the case of when Charles Murray tried to speak at Middlebury College. These are, to every blockade of me at Claremont McKenna, there is a daily reign of terror that is preventing conservatives from speaking out, from bucking the political orthodoxies. But this has been brewing for a long time as students who were immersed in multiculturalism and deconstruction in the 70s became tenured and now really are controlling the universities.
And you mentioned your time not a very fun time speaking at Claremont McKenna, which, for those who aren't familiar, is a great liberal arts school out in beautiful Southern California. You would not think it would necessarily be a breeding ground for cultural Marxism and violent progressives who are often as ignorant as they are arrogant in their positions. What was it like for you walking on that campus and witnessing the consequences of bad ideas?
Well, it really brought it home. You know, one can hear about these free speech attacks, but to be the center of it, as I was waiting in my safe house before I was supposed to talk, outside, nearly 300 students protesting me who had announced on Facebook that they needed to shut down the fascist, homophobe, queerphobe Heather McDonald, that I should not be allowed a platform to speak. What I was there for was to speak about my previous book, The War on Cops, which argued that the Black Lives Matter narrative about a endemically racist police force is simply untrue. We are not living through an epidemic of racially biased shootings of black men. The data does not bear that out. And I was also going to speak to the unrecognized support for the police in many high-crime minority neighborhoods. The bourgeois residents there are desperate for more police protection. This was a message that the students in the Claremont McKenna and the neighboring colleges viewed as utterly unacceptable, so they blockaded the auditorium where I was supposed to speak so that nobody could enter it, no faculty, no other student members. I was brought in under police escort through a secret passage. But while I was waiting to be brought into an empty auditorium, hearing these students chanting, beating drums, I couldn't see them. It did remind me, I don't want to be maudlin here and self-pitying, but when you hear the mob in action, you know, you don't know what it's going to do. It did sort of feel like, you know, the French Revolution, where people in groups, when they're in the grips of a mass hysteria, which is in fact the order of business today in universities in slow motion. The idea that universities are lethally racist and sexist is the product of a mass hysteria. But when you hear that in action, it is very, very troubling. So I gave my talk to a completely empty hall. The students outside were pounding on the glass windows. The police eventually decided that they could not guarantee my safety inside, and I was escorted out through the kitchen under police cover and put into a police van and taken to the Claremont City Police Department. This is just simply insane. It is a betrayal of what universities should be, but what I argue, Ben, is that as bad as the free speech enormities are, and as serious a threat they are to the American Constitution and how we go about debating things in our society peacefully and respectfully, the deeper malaise, the deeper danger is the victim ideology that is leading to this free speech crisis. And unless more people are willing to stand up and say, not only are universities not places of endemic racism and sexism, American society at large is not either. For all our historic sins, and they were real and great and terribly hypocritical given our founding ideals, today there isn't a single mainstream institution in this country that is not tying itself into knots to admit, hire, promote as many females and blacks and Hispanics as possible. If you're a white male today, to the contrary, good luck to you. You are going to have to meet much, much higher standards to be considered to be hired.
You talk about the perils of this victimization mindset, and what it really comes down to at the end of the day is the idea that individuals are not responsible for their own actions, that it is always outside external factors. And if you take that as the premise that everything is based upon society, not individual volition, individual choice, one's upbringing, one's values, and one's principles, then naturally there has to be a societal response. It almost creates the need and the justification for statism itself, where society becomes your family and your parents are taken out of the picture.
Bingo. I cannot salute what you just said more. You have put your finger on what I think is the defining difference between a liberal and a conservative worldview. A liberal sees social inequalities, and then they exist. You know, there are socioeconomic disparities. There are also group disparities, and will only accept as an explanation for those disparities structural racism or sexism. The conservative is more likely to see individual behavioral choices, personal responsibility. Now, a liberal would say that a conservative is blind to those structural factors, just as a conservative would say, how can you not see that having children out of wedlock increases your child's chances of being poor 5 times compared to the child of a married couple, and is going to lead your child, as Barack Obama himself dared to say before he was elected president, is going to consign your child to extremely high odds of dropping out of school, getting involved in gangs, getting involved in drugs, and ending up in prison. The decision to have children out of wedlock is a personal one. It is within everybody's control at this point. Other decisions such as studying, taking your textbooks home, having a parent that is actually monitoring schoolwork, those are the things today, I believe, the embrace of bourgeois values of deferred gratification that are the primary drivers of social inequalities, not structural racism, because that is, in my view, is largely at this point a phantom of the left.
And it's such a vital point about families, decisions that families make, the consequences of those decisions. And it's a civil society problem. It's not a problem that government is going to be able to solve with some incentives, nor is it necessarily the moral thing for government to determine how people organize their lives and nudge people, as Cass Sunstein would say, towards the right decisions. But the one area that the government does have control over are government schools. And I'm talking here K through 12 education, right up through public colleges as well. At the school level, from a practical perspective, if you tomorrow were named the school czar for America, what would be the policies that you would institute to try to reverse essentially a 100-year march through these institutions by progressivism?
Well, first of all, I just want to again second something you said, which is very wise, which is that policy is not the problem for the breakdown of the family. What has to be done is a revalorization of fathers, and it is a civil society. It's a normative question. There's a lot of conservative policy wonks out there who believe that if we just get tax codes or tax credits right, that we can have massive effects on cultural values. I view that as a form of policy porn. It's a false sense of power to be able to control the messy chaos of human life. What I would do and again, I just cannot state enough, we are living through a widespread attack on males. We're seeing that with the Me Too movement. We're seeing that in the attack on males in science fields and the phony feminist belief that males are toxic and that females can do it all. That is just not the case. Especially child rearing. Now, obviously, there's kids that they're orphans, or there's just some unavoidable disaster, and there's single mothers who are working very hard to succeed. But again, the averages are absolutely indisputable that, on average, kids thrive best with their biological mothers and fathers. What I would do, and what we need to do, how you do it, I don't know. What needs to happen is schools need to embrace that their only mission is putting into students' heads knowledge of the past and knowledge of scientific accomplishments. Their mission is not social justice. It's not community building. It's not affinity groups. I mean, the stories I've been hearing about pre-kindergarten now, immersing students in the LGBTQ agenda, in the Black Lives Matter agenda, it is hair-raising. It is everywhere. It cannot be overstated how pervasive this is. This has been a long-standing agenda of the education schools. Progressive education abjures any responsibility for knowledge. We need to return to the sense that there are books that are essential to being a human being, that you cannot claim to have experienced the full range of human feelings, emotions, grandeur, nobility, tragedy, and comedy until you have had some exposure, say, to the Greek tragedies or Renaissance literature or the English novel or the music of Mozart and Chopin, that those are summits of human experience, and we give faculty and professors and K through 12 teachers the greatest privilege in the world, which is to curate this legacy. And education is about passing on that inheritance from one generation to the next. And so we have to get back to a core curriculum and to a commitment to knowledge and not the pseudo, snake oil of critical thinking skills, which inevitably is simply shorthand for a left-wing anti-capitalist critique.
Heather, you put it so well. I want to leave it right there and let it sit and marinate, because this is such a vital argument that you're putting forth. And I think you're absolutely right that we as conservatives, liberty lovers, people that want to preserve this amazing civilization, have not thought through practically how we're going to counter this massive force on the other side. But it starts with recognizing what the problem is, recognizing ultimately what the goal is, and then we can figure out how to achieve it. As I mentioned, Heather is the author of exceptional books, the most recent one being The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. I urge you to read everything that Heather writes at City Journal and everywhere else. Heather, happy holidays. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
It's always enlightening speaking with you, Ben. Thank you.